all of the things that we like as architects and as an urbanist are there. It's mandatory to create a vibrant ground floor that is connected with public space. It's mandatory to have setbacks to create a more human scale. But I think developers are understanding the value not just of their own projects, but of the city. If you have a good city, you have a good business. We are currently living in a building that is 28 stories height in downtown, which was something inconceivable even 5 years ago in Monterrey. So there's been a lot of migration to the cities. Actually, 80% of the population in Mexico live in cities currently. I think historically, there was this misconception that real estate developers were, and I will simplify it, but they were evil because you always want to blame someone. We thought that we needed to be there in Mexico only because we wanted to be part of this rapid growth urban process that Mexico is experiencing.
Most Podern.
Welcome back to Most Podern. Ruben Segovia is a co-founder of LS Lab, where he leads architectural and urban design innovation. He founded and directs the master's degree in architecture and urban design at Tecnológico de Monterrey, his alma mater. After training at Harvard, he returned to Mexico in 2018 to found LS Lab, a design firm specializing in architecture, landscape, and urban processes. Welcome to Most Podern, Ruben.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Minkoo, for the invitation. Really excited to be here.
Well, I want to start off by going back to 7 or 8 years to that moment when you decided to go back to Mexico. What was happening in Mexico at the time, urbanistically, architecturally, that drew you back?
Yes, that's a great question. We were at a crossroads on where to start our firm. At that moment, we were at Boston. And we were thinking, because we had also projects in different parts of the world, we were collaborating with an office called the Kuma Frenchman. We were doing some urban design and urban analysis projects in Saudi Arabia. And also we started doing in Boston some projects in the Yucatan Peninsula. Some of them based with some friends, some of them derived from some of the research that we did at the GSD. So we were thinking maybe we could base the office in Boston and address those projects elsewhere. But we thought that we needed to be there in Mexico because we wanted to be part of this rapid growth urban process that Mexico is experiencing. And we wanted to be there firsthand and understand with our vision for the office, our idea of how to address climate change, how to address housing scarcity, how to address the stress of ecosystems, how could we do it through architecture? And the great thing about Mexico is that there's a lot of opportunity to explore those ideas and those opportunities. So we moved directly into the Yucatan Peninsula, specifically into Quintana Roo, to start working on ideas of especially housing in Tulum and in Playa del Carmen.
Can you describe what that urban development process is like right now in Mexico? You say it's really fast-paced, it's developing rapidly. What was it that stood out to you as an architect that said, I need to be there specifically?
Yeah, actually, Mexico is growing quite fast, but also unevenly. And you have cities that are expanding outward with low density housing, while especially developers are trying to grow up and do a little bit of infill operations. So there's a demand across the board. There's a demand on housing, but also a demand in terms of logistics. Tourism plays also a huge role in the built environment. So the speed of change in urban settlements and in urban processes often outpaces planning. And you can tell that because you have a lot of real estate speculation that it's well planned and it's well thought of. For example, here in Monterrey, there's a revitalization of downtown that it was completely forgotten for decades. But at the same time, you have these urban sprawl processes of informal settlements. So you have those two ways happening at the same time. And what is interesting for architects and urban designers is that you can insert yourself in either of those processes or even on both as a researcher, also as a practitioner.
What's the current state of the housing market in Mexico?
There's a lot of speculation, and recently there's been a lot of studies published that housing is really expensive, both in terms of rentals, but also buying. So there's a lot of real estate speculation. There's a lot of housing is treated more of an economic commodity rather than a human right, which is a huge problem here in Mexico because for young people, it's really difficult, especially for professionals, to get their own place to live. So there's a lot of you start to see a lot of mixed programs with extended families because it's quite difficult to get your own house, your own apartment unit. And at the same time, there's a sort of counter movement that it's to build by yourself and grab land by yourself, which is been happening from for a long time from now. But in terms of real estate development, it's getting a little bit um, more professional. It was a work in progress in the past decades. Developers have been learning a lot from American models in terms of program mixes, in terms of efficiency, in terms also of marketing as well. So for architects, that professionalization of real estate development, it's really helpful because it lays the ground in a smoother way. So it allows you to explore instead of thinking about the program complexities, you think about the spatial complexities and urban complexities. And it's more of the role of the developer to lay out the basis for a successful economic project.
Is this housing shortage, or I don't know if it's verging on a crisis yet, is that something that has happened more recently because of the economic development and rapid urbanization and development, or is it something that's always been there?
It's always been there, but it's been growing exponentially in the last 10 years, especially because, for example, cities, peripheral cities, you might say from Mexico City, which is the capital, cities like Monterrey, Guadalajara are adding a lot of new residents each year. And also these, let's say, second tier cities like Querétaro, Mérida, Tulum are growing also exponentially. So there's a challenge there to understand how this migration, both internal migration but also external migration, because instead of these economic uncertainties that are happening, Mexico has been very stable in terms of economic growth, and there's a lot of opportunity for work. There's a lot of opportunity for a stable income and a stable life. So there's been a lot of migration to the cities. Actually, 80% of the population in Mexico live in cities currently. So there's a challenge there because cities are growing really fast in the last 20 years. And that's something that has been acknowledged recently by our new president, by Claudia Sheinbaum. So she creates a project to address this housing scarcity. And what they are doing is they are identifying pieces of land that are in central spaces of the city, and they are trying to densify those with affordable housing projects. So that's going to happen in the next 2 to 3 years. It's not going to satisfy the need for housing, but it's a nice experiment that is similar to experiments that happen in the feast of the past century.
Interesting. So it's not a phenomenon that's new to any particular place. Work is located in urban centers. People are coming in, trying to accommodate that. What's been the model for accommodating that urban growth up until now?
It depends on the political agenda. For example, there's a municipality nearby Monterrey. Monterrey, it's comprised of several municipalities or the metropolitan area. And they create this huge urban fabric. And there's a municipality called San Pedro, which is one of the richest municipalities in Latin America. And the previous administration was advocating for more density. And we're actually doing a project in a very historic uh, part that is called Casa del Valle, which mostly in the past was filled with programs like commercial programs or bank services and very low density programs. And the past administration created a new urban plan to create more density, to create more mixed medium density projects in which you activate the ground floor with the diverse activities with public space, and you create 5 to 6 stories height of housing components. And that everything changed with the new administration, which is trying to pursue a more conservative vision for the municipality, in which they try to go back to the old model of single family units, low density. So it depends on the political alignment of how they envision the city. But still, I think there's a national idea of creating a more sustainable, connected, and this idea of the 15-minute city of proximity is happening across all of the cities. So there's a desire to generate transit-oriented developments. For example, here in Monterrey is something that is happening in downtown. So we are currently living in a building that is 28 stories height in downtown, which was something inconceivable even 5 years ago in Monterrey.
Have you ever wondered why housing is so expensive, why traffic never improves, and why new buildings all look the same? If you're trying to make sense of how the built environment actually works and what could make it better, make sure to subscribe to Most Podern on YouTube or your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. If today's discussion resonates with you, give us a like, drop a comment, share the episode, and help us push the conversation forward.
It's not very homogeneous, as you might hear. There's a lot of heterogeneity in the housing development.
Interesting. And I assume that if you're talking about making cities more walkable, you're talking about more density. The predominant model is probably based on around automobile transportation, things being spread out. Is that right?
Yes, and that's a huge challenge in Mexican cities. Mobility, both in terms of the means, but also the quality of how you experience the city. Because of these processes of urban sprawl that we mentioned, it's really difficult for someone that is working 2 hours away from their workplace to have a decent way of living, right? And temperature is also quite extreme in our cities. So yeah, that's a huge challenge. There are certain governments that are addressing that. For example, in Jalisco, they are doing fantastic job of creating hybrid systems of articulated buses connected with some bike lanes. Here in Monterrey, we have an elevated high-speed rail that is in construction. Um, and there's also a lot of community-driven groups that advocate for cycling, for walking more, for connecting the city at a more human level. So, and it's something that we explore a lot of in our projects, even though we're doing sometimes housing projects. How can we land those buildings and those ideas into a more gentle urban fabric?
Speaking of communities, what are the deeper forces, either cultural or environmental or historic, that continue to shape the cities in Mexico's take form?
That's a good question. I think in recent years, there's an increase in community awareness of urban processes. I give you a rough example, but there's a plan to build an express highway on top of a river right now here in Monterrey, on top of Santa Catarina River. And that's been currently on hold because of community groups that advocate for the river and for the importance of the river in the ecosystem processes. So I think that was inconceivable in maybe 30 years ago, in which the government had a lot of agency. But right now, and I think social media plays a huge role in those processes. Right now, I think communities and urban dwellers are extremely more aware of what's happening, and they are understanding, especially new generations. I can see them in our students. They are understanding the importance of every decision that we are making that has an impact on the built environment, both in terms of where materials are coming from, which programs are we building, how they connect with deeper problems like social inequality, with lack of public space. So I think trying to answer your question, Minkoo, is there's a deeper role right now that communities have in the development of the city.
I just want to paint a picture before we move on to LS Lab's work. If you were to describe the prototypical Mexican city, is it possible? Could you sort of encapsulate it for us in a couple sentences?
It's difficult because it changes from the different latitudes. So, for example, in northern cities, they have a huge influence from American cities. So you can think of Monterrey more closer to maybe Texan cities, in which you have this car predominance, in which you have these places that are heavily industrialized, and you have large scopes of land. And for example, cities that are more towards the center part of Mexico, or even the south, are still rooted somehow in colonial urban traces, in which Downtown has a lower scale. They have a lot of Spaniard architecture, heritage buildings. You have the idea of the plaza, the government center, the market, and the new development is happening at the periphery, creating a denser urban sprawl because maybe downtown is historically protected. So it changes from city to city. But I would say if I have to generalize, maybe northern cities are more industrialized and more aligned to this idea of rapid growth that is tied in with land speculation. And central cities, taking away Mexico City, which is a different process altogether, they still retain some of that characteristic and historical downtowns.
Is it the private market that drives those forces and changes, or is it still like the government who leads these big changes when it comes to city making?
Definitely, in terms of housing, it's a private market, the main driver. In the last administration, in terms of public space, there was a great program by SEDATU, which is the Secretary of Urban Development and Territorial Development. And they created this project in which they started to invite very interesting architecture firms to create public spaces. For example, parks, plazas, markets. Some of them you may recognize them because they have been winning very prestigious architecture awards. So I think in the last year, government had a little bit more of agency in terms of the public space, the street as well, creating streets with different streets more focused on pedestrians and in active mobility. And housing has been in the last maybe around 60 years, it's been driven by private markets.
Well, I think it's a good time to then move into LS Lab's work and your own practice. Can you describe what your research or your design agenda is and how it's played out in the past 7 or 8 years since you started the firm?
In the office, we've been exploring different scales. That's something that has been very interesting for us, exploring from the architecture object, moving into larger processes with a similar methodology in which we first try to understand the context and the territory that we're working with, even though that we are given maybe sometimes a specific piece or plot of land. We try to create maps and through cartography understand the larger processes. What is the culture of the place? What is the materiality and construction processes that are being used? And what is the ecology of the place, both in the geophysical ecology, but also the social ecology? And we try to make an interpretation of that into the project. And because so maybe all of the projects, they look different in terms of geometries, form, but they have the same spirit of trying to honor the place in which we are working. So for example, a lot of the projects that we did in very lush environments like Tulum or Playa del Carmen, we try to minimize the footprint of the buildings to give way to nature and make nature part of the program, even though it was not in the brief, in the design brief. So in other projects like the one that I've been telling you that we're doing here in Calzada Valle, collaborating with another firm, with Fundamenta, it's completely different approach in which is more about the urban quality of the space because we are in front of us, there's a very important linear park. So how can we extend that particular urban behavior of that urban space and bring it into the project? Another, let's say, mantra of the office is to create a lot of collaborations and collaborative processes. So most of the project we've been working with partners, a lot of partners that I met at the master's program at GSD. Partners like we're doing a master plan project in Chihuahua that is called Ciudadana, in which is a 140 hectare piece of land. And we are developing a mixed use there. And we did it with an urban designer, with Claudia Tomateo, and with a landscape architect, Thomas Niederwest, both from the GSD. So we try to embed that idea of the importance of the main urban components, like creating sustainable communities, to create the idea of proximity, but also bring in ideas of landscape components like catching water and storing it, honoring the river that was already there, using local species. So I think also the spirit of the office is to keep learning from other disciplines. We are at the core architects. We don't know, and we don't pretend to know everything. So through collaboration, we keep this process not to offer more services to our clients, but to understand how other disciplines are as important or even more important than architecture in our projects.
Love it. Architects who break the scope and expand further.
Yes, exactly. And just to expand the scope, not for ourselves, but for the project and for the benefit of the project. I think that's really important. For example, in this master plan in Ciudadana, we were thinking, how can we maximize public space within the limits of the scope of the program and still make it profitable for the clients and for the developers? Which, by the way, is also something that happened organically, but also we've been working with amazing developers that understand the ideas, the vision, how can we add more to the city through creating value, both economic value, but also social value, ecosystemic value. Of course, there's from time to time you deal with clients that they don't align with the vision, and it's very healthy to acknowledge that and maybe to not pursue the project forward. But I think with time you start to align with individuals that have similar visions. And something that is really encouraging is that we've been working with a lot of quote unquote young developers because we're not young anymore, but young developers that sometimes you think when you are in academia that only designers or your close group have this vision of a better world based on equality, based on honoring the site, understanding the context. But it's nice to see that also developers are aligning to those visions and they are understanding that maybe they have a larger impact than us. So we've been seeing that in our projects, and sometimes at the beginning we were really doubtful if they were understand those ideas, how to create open cities instead of creating walls to connect with the surrounding context, which is really risky in a Mexican context of
How come?
of well, not right now, but there are certain cities that are still experiencing issues about safety, issues about state of law, and let's say.
Mhm.
And so, in our minds, the wall represents a luxury. So, gated communities are quite luxurious and they make a lot of the urban fabric, especially the contemporary urban fabric. So, for us, when we are doing master plans and projects to propose ideas of openness, of connecting those processes to neighbors, connecting to future development, it's something that sounds maybe in other contexts and in other places and countries doesn't sound as risky, but here is a little bit risky, especially for a developer that wants to market their neighbors, the neighborhoods as safe and protected and regulated. But I think developers are understanding the value not just of their own projects, but of the city. City, if you have a good city, you have a good business.
Mhm.
And if you add up to that and you create value not just for your product, but for the surroundings, and it creates a positive cycle of both increasing social value, cultural value, economic value.
You mentioned the, I guess, important role that policy and government has in development in Mexico. Is that something that developers are facing? Not say necessarily pressure, but maybe some push towards making cities a certain way.
Yes, and I think we've been lucky enough to align with bold developers. So just to give you an example, in Ciudadana, the developers are called Urbanología, and they are young developers. They did their master's program, the real estate program at Columbia. So they came back to Mexico with this idea of what I mentioned, good cities, a good business. So when they invited us to collaborate in this 140-hectare project, originally that was tagged as a single family piece of land, a single family housing piece of land. So low density, just one program, just to create these sort of developments that we've been discussing in the periphery. The project is also in the northern periphery of Chihuahua. Um, so we started to workshop ideas through maps and cartographies to understand what is actually needed there. And we discovered that there was a lack of mobility. There was no public transportation nearby. There was a lack of public space. There was a lack of job opportunities. There was a lack of infrastructure as well, both in terms of physical but also social infrastructure. So based on that lecture of the territory, of reading the territory, we understood that we needed to go with the government, and mostly they did that heavy lifting part and apply for a land use change. And that took many years, but it starts with a conviction that if you're doing such a scale of a project, it needs to align with your vision and your ideas of a good city, especially because it's their city. That's where they were born. So they want also to create a legacy of what it means to be a contemporary developer. And it's happening right now. It's getting built right now. And it's really exciting to that project is also setting a new standard in future urban developments, which are taking into account ideas of cycling, of linear parks, of water catchment and retention. Ideas that typically they are maybe in other contexts are a given or maybe are mandatory from the government, but here it's something that we are bringing into the table as an integral part of the project.
So it's great to hear that there are this young generation of developers out there who are trying to make a change. But I'm also wondering, still assume that they will be a very small portion. So I'm wondering if they're how typically developers see architects in Mexico and vice versa. How does architects in Mexico see developers?
I think developers understand the value of design right now. It was something maybe a little bit more abstract in the past. I've been working my first job when I came out of undergrad. I started working right away with developers in the offices where I was practicing and I'm still learning. And maybe 10 years ago or maybe 12 years ago, for the developer, it was difficult to understand the value of good decisions through design. But right now, they understand that it's something basic and integral for the success of the project. And it's also an idea of marketing the project. If it's well designed, it's going to give right away a market value and it's going to be different from other projects. And that just in terms of architecture design, that it's the spaces are well naturally lit, that are well ventilated, that the facades are interesting, the geometries are interesting, materiality as well. What we are trying to explore with our office is all of that, that is very important, but also how the architecture object creates a better urban context and a better city. So how the building, when it lands into the site, creates a positive effect, not just for the people that bought a unit in the project, but for elsewhere, the neighbors, for the people that are just passing by, for mobility, for the street, for the sidewalk, for the public space. And I think young developers are understanding that very well. And maybe the more established ones, you still need to negotiate certain things. Those ideas of an open city or those ideas of giving a little bit of to the city that it's not sellable or they don't see it as an economic value. You have to still sacrifice certain things, but also have some very important quick wins. But I see that younger developers they are understanding the value that brings into the table because in the end they understand that maybe it sounds very heroic, but that they are creating the future of their environment and of their own cities.
I just want to expand that conversation a little bit because it seems like that's a lot of frustration in a lot of places that people, whether they're the architects or the citizens or even the developers themselves, feel that the project can only go so far as the pro forma allows it, or the product is the same as the project and we're only concerned about what is saleable, what is leasable, etc. What is it that's changing in Mexico, aside from the generation of the developers? Obviously a different worldview, a different experience, but you had mentioned, for instance, social media before. Is there something else that we can learn that is causing people to rethink the value of design, of buildings, of places beyond simply what its financial value is?
Yes, I think there's also a new generation of lawmakers and people working in policy. So, for example, the project that we are doing in Calzada del Valle, maybe 5 years ago or 6 years ago, was not possible because the proper city guidelines were not in place. So they created a very interesting urban development program in which all of the things that we like as architects and as an urbanist are there. It's mandatory to create a vibrant ground floor that it's connected with public space. It's mandatory to have setbacks to create a more human scale. It's mandatory to cap the height at 6 levels, to have a certain amount, a percentage of green areas, of vegetation. And that's because young generations of people that came back also from their master's program from both within Mexico but also elsewhere are understanding those ideas of the value of creating a good city. Not in this case, not just in terms of economic value, but of in terms of social health. That if you create a, a city that is more connected with the public realm, a city that is more connected with mobility, immediately you start to create a healthy society. And a safe society as well, because also the idea of these projects is to be connected with the ground level, so you see who is your neighbor, what everyone's doing, to create as some sort of commonality or common space, or the idea of the commons in a capital world, right? So it's, I think, for example, the program that I mentioned in Sadatu, it was also from Roman Meyer, who is a young architect from Tech, and I think he did his master's program at Columbia. And he embedded himself in the public service area. So there's also this new idea, new generations of architects that are understanding also the value of working with policy, not just with design, which I think was the frustration that you mentioned, Alex, in which there's always have been a lot of very talented architects in Mexico in terms of design, but they were clashing about very rigid policies that benefited especially the pro forma and the profitability. And right now we are encountering these openings. They are not longer gaps, but they are very explicit openings to create more interesting urban projects within architecture.
I think that's absolutely fascinating, to be honest, because I think one of the frustrations that a lot of people have in, let's say, in America, is there are people who really care about the urban environment, but they don't seem to be either the people who have the budget or the authority to make a difference. And I think that there's just a lot of these clashes happening, not just between architects and their clients, but between the city with the developers and the designers themselves too, in terms of how do we move things forward. Maybe it has to do with cost and labor and all these other pressures, but it's I think heartening. It's heartwarming to see that at least in Mexico there is the potential for people with a vision and know-how and energy to go out and make a difference.
Yeah, I think historically, there was this misconception that real estate developers were, and I will simplify it, but they were evil, because you always want to blame someone. But in reality, real estate developers were working with the ground rules that set in place, that the governments and different policies made. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think when you have strong policies that are suited for better urban environments, real estate developers are going to align with that, and they are going to design their performance based on that. So if the municipality is making you give more public space in the ground floor, you're going to do it because they are going to allow you to have more density. So I think also because developers are more sophisticated right now, they are understanding how to take advantage of those policies that in the past might have been seen as difficulties or setbacks for the developers.
Yeah, we're fighting with this bad stigma of developers. There's a bad image that developers are evil.
I think, isn't it? I mean, I think it's sort of true. It's like if we can get to a point in whatever society where developers aren't necessarily evil, either because of their own actions and what they demonstrate, or just of sentiment, and allow developers to actually cook, allow them to do what they need to do, then we can get to a point where good things can happen. But at the end of the day, I think people do need to realize that regardless of the intention of the developer, you do need someone to do the project, right? Like you need someone to put up the money, to get all the permits, to run down and manage the project. It's not going to happen by itself. And I think we're in the point, just speaking from the American context, where still very wary of what developers are going to do, and wary that they're going to pull one over someone and try to take advantage of the situation for their own profit. And in some cases, just nothing happens. Minkoo and I, we always talk about this kind of stuff all the time. But I do think that it would be nice to get to the point where, yes, as you're saying, the rules of the game have changed to incentivize good things happening instead of can be taken advantage of potentially.
Yeah, and I think also working with developers is a two-way process of learning. I think us architects, we also need to learn from their way of thinking, of seeing things in a very efficient way, from seeing things also. I think developers are really important for the city. And I remember Dennis Frenchman saying that it's more important a good developer than a good architect, because if you have a good developer and a bad architect, the project is still going to be good because the developer is the core of the, well, here in Mexico, because we're still a very neoliberal country, the real estate developer is the core engine of the city. I think one of the challenges that we have here is that we need to have more schools that deal with real estate programs. We're trying to jumpstart that tech, and because also developers, they not necessarily are architects or designers or even civil engineers. They might be other professions, and they are really curious to get into the city business world. So I think we need more education about that here in Mexico. I think that the greatest developers here are the ones that went elsewhere to understand these concepts of how to create a good city and good value, and they brought them back. And I think that's something that we try to do, not in a preachy way, but at the work here at LS Lab, is to, with other developers that they didn't have the opportunity to grasp those knowledge or those processes, to bring case studies into the table, to have a conversation of what is happening elsewhere, why those ideas, they are not something of our imagination or something that we created out of the blue, but they are proven strategies that can increase the profit of the project because you are adding value to your context, to your city, to the natural environment.
Are the new wave of developments something visible from the outside? Do you see any kind of specific patterns of design or features that symbolizes the new generation of development in Mexico?
Yes, I think new developments that are, especially when you see the ground level, that those ground levels are activated, are more open. There are a hybrid of maybe a public space in which you need to buy an ice cream or you need to um, grab a hamburger or buy something, buy some clothes. You can use that public space, but it's a hybrid in which you create value both for the retailer, but also you create value for the visitor and those public spaces, and you create maybe more porous ground floors. And maybe the architecture is whatever on the top. But when you see those ground floors being very active, very conscious of their context, of their environment, that's when you start to understand that the market is shifting and the buyers and the market is demanding those spaces. So here in Monterrey, you have several projects. One of those that maybe jump-started everything was Arboleda, in which it was a Cesar Pelli master plan. And with a very visionary developer that understood that through public space and through the public realm, you create not just of the luxury of materials and the luxury of large unit spaces, but through public space on the ground floor, you can create more value. And that created a new standard in development. And so new projects, not I will say not all of them, right? But there's it's a trend of new projects in which ground floors are very active, very connected to the urban environment, and that creates an intrinsic value for the project.
What is it specifically that the inhabitants are valuing in those types of spaces? The convenience, the energy?
I think um, the idea that you can bring your family there um, and um, have a nice afternoon with your family and just enjoy your time, and that creates a sense of identity here in Monterrey, and I think all of the cities in Mexico, people are very proud of their cities, and so they want to see them thrive. And when you understand that you can do that you can create an identity, a sense of community, sense of safety through architecture and through new urban developments, maybe they don't rationalize it as well, but to have that nice experience, a nice afternoon with your family, with your kids just running around, maybe just go shopping and have a cafe at a terrace that is connected with the street. I think people are starting to understand the value of that. Tec de Monterrey also did that with their borders, with their university borders. There are universities here, especially private universities, they are not as open as other universities like, let's say, MIT or Harvard, which their campuses are more porous and you can just navigate around them. So at Tech, they started to blur the boundaries of the campus and create pocket parks and create set back the fences and create more vegetation, larger sidewalks. And I think there's a trend for new developments to have that attitude towards the public. And it's something that people maybe don't rationalize or post rationalize, but they understand that that is creating also an identity for their cities.
Yeah, to me, it always made sense, like it from a intuition level, right? Like in order to have a successful built real estate asset needs to be well used and loved by the people who use it. It's just simple like that. So I always didn't understand why developers were so afraid of testing new ideas. But after doing it myself, you can see that, one misstep really you can lose your shirt. That's why. But it's very encouraging to hear about this new generation of development happening in Mexico.
Yeah, and especially when there's so much talk, regardless of where you are, about the walkable city, about, especially post-COVID, what's happened to our physical public space. I've always found that Mexico, when I visit it, it's just such a vibrant place. And so it does make sense that you would take advantage of that characteristic and that asset and make places for that. Now, we've been talking about Monterrey and a lot of the work you've been doing in some of the larger cities. You also mentioned you've been working on the Yucatan Peninsula and working specifically in Tulum. So I just want to take a moment to maybe focus on that area for a bit. And if you could explain to us what your project is, and also some of the larger changes that are happening in Tulum around, I guess, tourism and speculative development in that region.
Yes, I think Tulum it's a very interesting case study to see how tourism, land speculation, and environmental limits crash into each other. I think the pace of building in Tulum has overwhelmed the infrastructure, and the ecological cost, you can see that is visible. So when we started working at Tulum, we noticed that, and we detected that we were always thinking, how can we, in a sense, approach a housing project or a hospitality project with certain responsibility towards the site, not against it. That means, for example, very simple things that maybe we forget as we make our designer minds more complex, but keep the native vegetation in place as much as possible. Use permeable spaces and permeable materials, spaces in which you could open your window and create cross ventilation and minimize the use of AC. As I mentioned, for example, in the Selva project, we minimize the urban footprint and we put it in the limits of the perimeter block to create a giant interior garden and create as much permeable soil as possible. So it is inevitable that every architecture project scars the land somehow, even though you're trying to be as delicate and as thoughtful as possible. So we try to curate a counterintuitive measure in which, if we minimize the footprint and the land that is affected, we try to restore it within that interior courtyard. Maybe we can maybe we can remediate the soil a little bit more. And similar attitude towards the rest of the projects, because in Tulum, what tourism was looking, it was a paradox, because tourism was looking for a connection with nature and a connection with the ecosystems, and that influx was destroying the systems in itself. So we try to approach that with caution, but also with a lot of responsibility. How the projects could be, sounds at this time a very washed out word, but how can they be sustainable without a lot of means? So make it very simple solutions, very cost efficient solutions. To make it also, they were also developed by real estate developers, so make it also profitable. Thankfully, all of the projects were really successful in terms of real estate market, but also how to embed these qualities, permeable soils, to be as much as open in terms of the facades and in terms of the circulations towards the context, to create a dynamic facade, not just through architecture, but also through people. So you can see people moving around the facades and connecting with the sidewalk. And for us, it was also a huge learning process, because we wanted to incorporate only local construction knowledge. So to understand how people build there, what are the materials, how to deal from the foundations. The foundations are really different from the foundations that are used in Monterrey, because the soil is different. You might think that the soil is really soft, but it's a very hard soil made out of rocks. So the foundations are done completely different that I have seen before. They are made, it's a really intuitive process, because they are made out of the same stone that you excavate. And so you mix the same stone with concrete and you create the foundation. So it's almost like just playing with the material that is in place, using local techniques like chukun finishes, working a lot of with the local builders was really interesting. So yeah, and also developers, they always want to cut down costs, not in a bad way, but how to help them to find a cheaper material, but it's also very performative, how to find. So in that sense, we create a better orientation of the building to minimize the use of resources, and that allows you to have thinner walls, and that's cost effective in a sense.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think if you see the big picture and maybe all of the different reports that came out from there, not everyone had that sensibility. Not everyone had the sensibility to preserve as much as possible the natural environment. And that created a very unsustainable tourism, a very unsustainable built environment. So I think luckily the pace is slowing down, the construction pace,
Hmm.
and that maybe that will allow to Tulum to reflect on what they've been doing and how can they create go back to the idea of a sustainable tourism, a sustainable development. Um, yeah.
You mentioned sustainable building design, and in the context of where I work, um, it is more of a top-down requirement now for new development from the city to meet a certain energy requirement code. Is it similar in Mexico? Is it more organic? That's kind of a responsibility of the market.
It's currently more organic and it changes from city to city. There are cities and projects that are pursuing certain standards that in another episode we can discuss, like LEED standards, for example, which
Hmm.
also they entitle a lot of discussions, but they are not mandatory. They are really organic. For example, say developers use LEED standards as a market placement idea, so that if your building is LEED certified, it's going to have an added value for the users, right? But it's not mandatory in that sense. For example, in Tulum, we were using very basic technology to build. Nothing, everything meets code, but at the same time, nothing meets code, right? So it's very low tech technology, very basic construction technology, very raw materials. So in a sense, you have to go back to the roots of sustainability, which are geometry, solar orientation, cross ventilation, creating shade through the building, but also through leaving as much nature as possible, catching water to restore the soil. There were a lot of projects in which we use instead of roof gardens, pool gardens on the rooftops to cool down the buildings as well, but also it's an amenity. So it was playing with low economic means and not the idea of scarcity because it's a real estate development, but the idea of how to have a larger impact with a low amount of means and technologies.
Efficiency. Look, Ruben, it's actually quite amazing when we talk to you about this that at such a young age, you're working one across an entire country, but you're also doing projects in both the tropics on the Yucatan Peninsula, but also in the desert closer to Monterey. Is that, I guess, jump back and forth between different climatic contexts? Is that something that you have to worry a lot about? Is it something that comes naturally? I would find it to be quite interesting to be working both in terms of cross ventilation, but also probably like shade, making sure you have enough shade in the desert.
Yes, that's a great question because you have to really quickly adapt to these new conditions. So, for example, the project that we're doing in Chihuahua, you have to deal with water scarcity as well. Whereas in the Yucatan Peninsula, it's a very humid place and a place when you have a monsoon season and you have a lot of rainy seasons. In Chihuahua, it's a dry context, similar to Monterrey, in which is Monterrey is more seasonal. You have rainy seasons, but you have also extreme heat weather conditions. So yeah, you have to adapt quite quickly because you have tight deadlines. For example, the landscape strategies are quite different. Whereas in Yucatan, the soil is really gentle, and whatever you put there, it's going to blossom. In Chihuahua, you have to be more careful, both in terms, because it's a more industrialized city, you can get any species, but that doesn't mean that you have to use any species. So you have to think about species that are endemic or local or adapted that consume very little or no water, that they are going to grow through species that they are going to attract to their with the birds and butterflies and everything that is going to pollinate further. So
How about on the public activations point? You talk about your projects try to bring people in or open up. Is that something that's possible in one climatic context, but harder potentially in another?
yeah, for example, in Ciudadana, we also been lucky to win the competition to design within the master plan the public park, and we did that with Alejandro Echeverri, which is a Colombian architect that was very involved in the transformation of Medellin with Sergio Fajardo, and also with another office called Territorial. And that the strategy was 100% how to deal with shading and create shade. And once you create a shade, you instantly create a public space because shade is crucial in Chihuahua because of the extreme weather. So the whole park is about creating shade with just two very simple techniques. One is natural shade through the species that we selected for tree canopy, and through creating artificial shade through this architecture design shade canopies. And that's it. The rest, the program has been changing, shifting the activation and the strategies, but shade and also acknowledging that this how the soil is going to behave in terms of this drought season. Seasons in Chihuahua is really important. It's very different because in the Yucatan Peninsula you look out for the shade, but not as much because it's really humid as well. So yeah, it's an interesting question. That's why before we start any project, we do a lot of research. We try to involve not only the typical specialists, but also, for example, biologists that will tell us about local species in the Ciudadana project because Urbanología developers are really interesting and future minded. We were also working with social workers as well to understand the repercussions of having these programs. So yeah, the research is key before starting even a very simple project as a housing one or a single family house. We always zoom out and start to, through GIS techniques, mapping, understand what is suitable for the site.
Lots to consider when it comes to design. There's no doubt about that. Throw it
What's
in
the developers response when you bring more consultants to the table?
That's a good one because they are not within the budget, right? It depends. I mean, some consultants, because we have one foot in academia and one foot in private practice, I think we sometimes involve academia to fill those gaps, not in terms of specifically that project, but for example, we try to do projects that help the students understand certain things, but also help us to bring other experts like biologists that Tec de Monterrey have and to develop side projects that help to enrich the context, but also in a non-cynical way to help us to have gather information. I think having said that, I think developers are very open and actually they're asking us lately, what do you need for the project? What do you need? Because in my expertise, maybe I only need the typical civil engineer and the electrical engineer, and maybe if they are more experienced, they have the hydrologist. But they always ask us, "Do you need anything else in terms of specialists?" So that's also part of the sophistication of the real estate world. They are seeing if there are some other players that they could bring into the table that are really important for decision making.
That's amazing. I really envy that environment. It sounds like, if there's a will, there's a way, right? And it sounds like the developers understand, and potentially I think the market itself is not as mature as the US, where things are really tight and the margins are very tight. There's a limited amount of opportunity for growth. I mean, although it's growing quite significantly every year. But because of these conditions, I think the developers here are a little bit more risk averse and try to play safe. And that's the focus because the budget itself is very large. And like I said, you can lose your shirt. But it sounds like in Mexico, while it's more of an inceptional phase where a lot of experiments can happen. There's a lot of support from the city and also from developers. So, it's an exciting time.
Yeah, and just to follow up with your comment, Minkoo, I think right now, because we don't have the maturity as the US in terms of real estate development, every bad decision is going to cost money. So developers are trying to minimize any sort of error And if you see the pro forma, if you make these smaller efforts to having a larger budget at the beginning, will have a huge impact in decision making
Hmm.
on the long term. So I guess in the US, it's a very polished formula that it's been working. That's why you don't bring so
Yeah.
many consultants into the table. But right now, because we are learning a lot of the real estate market, and it's also very competitive. You have to differentiate yourself somehow. The developers are trying to understand what else can they bring into the table, so there aren't any mistakes down the
Hmm.
road.
Yeah, it represents room for creativity, not just in design, but in financing and
Mhm.
also structuring that financing. Whereas here, every entity is kind of institutionalized and they come with their own requested rates and they're all kind of interconnected, where it leaves very small room for the developers to even think about doing something out of the typical practice. So that's what I'm saying in terms of why I envy where you are in now. Not because I'm saying that the developers there are not rigorous with their numbers. I'm sure they are, but the industry itself is a little loose, I assume, where it gives freedom to think about outside of the box more.
Yeah, and it's very organic in terms of innovation also, which is a good and a bad way. If a developer brings a new program into the table, everyone else will follow, and maybe on the long term, you will see that it wasn't a great idea. But some other programs they might blossom some certain like very interesting amenities or certain apartment typologies. So yeah. So for example. Right now, developers are exploring more about the spatial component of the apartment. How can you make it more spacious? Because you are competing in terms of cost with single family houses that are in the outskirts versus central apartments in new developments here in downtown. So how can you differentiate yourself with a unit that is smaller in square footage? So they're experimenting with double height apartments or more connected with the views of the city or more interesting layouts as well.
Nice.
Fascinating. Well, it seems like, Ruben, you've laid the scene. Mexico right now is a place where there's a lot of things happening. There's potentially a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of challenges at the same time. I'm particularly interested in talking to you since you you founded the urban design program at Tec Monterrey. So, if you can answer this next question both as an architect and a designer, but also as somebody who researches and teaches, what do you think about the future of Mexican cities? What excites you? What do you find interesting? Things that one should pursue and kind of think about more, and maybe what concerns you?
What excites me also when I see the students in our program is the optimism that we could change things because there are a lot of challenges that are happening. What is exciting about our program is that we have a mixture in our cohort of people that are working in private practices, but also in government. So the conversations are really interesting. And overall, all of the practitioners are very optimistic about what could happen in cities because we are seeing, luckily, good examples of good urban interventions, public spaces, what we mentioned about the shift in real estate. So I see a lot of positivism, a lot of optimism, a lot of opportunity in spite of all of this world economic instability and what's happening globally. Mexico still somehow manages to be quite stable. So there's an optimism that through real estate, that through city, we could create a better environment. And there's of course a lot of challenges. And one of the challenges is that we don't plan ahead enough. For example, we try to solve our crises right on the spot when they are happening. So, for example, a couple of years ago, 3 years ago exactly, we almost reached in Monterrey the day zero with no water supply. So all of dams were almost dry. The reservoirs dropped under 20% of their capacity. Um, and we were trying to solve everything right on the spot instead of thinking long-term solutions. And we're right back at it, trying to build express highways on top of rivers and stuff like that. So I think one of the challenges is to acknowledge, but I think that's a global challenge that we are seeing in all of the political shifts that we are experiencing, is that we are creating a battle against the environment. I think individuals understand that there's a need for a change, but there's a political pace that doesn't recognize that. I think luckily in terms of governance, we have a president currently that has a very good sense of that the importance of the environment, and it's trying to create certain policies for that. But in general, at the same time that, for example, developers and governments understand the value of creating good cities, we need to embed the idea of creating good environments as well. That it's something that creates value as well because it helps us to survive as humans. We are, for example, in a lot of cities in Mexico experiencing challenges of air pollution and the quality of air because of these rapid urban processes that are creating a lot of land extraction and creating a lot of components into the air. But yeah, there's that. We also talk in a very positive way about real estate development, but there's a housing scarcity, and not everyone can afford those developments.
Mhm.
So there's a social disparity that is quite striking in Mexico. Those who are rich are very rich, and those who are poor, it's something that you cannot believe is happening in this day and age.
Mhm.
So I think that's a huge challenge that we need to address. The right to the city, the idea of the right to the city is something that should be right now solved, but it's not. So no, you can be shocked by how certain communities live without any basic services. So I think those challenges helps us understand that despite that we are moving forward in terms of city thinking, in a way of how to innovate in terms of real estate development, there are other things that we need to bring to the table: environmental concerns, social concerns, equality concerns as well. And I think that's the next challenge for us as we are winning slowly a battle about the importance of the urban fabric, of the urban context, of the urban life. We need to start or keep playing that battle of the importance of the aquifers, the importance of water, the importance of climate, the importance of the air quality, the importance of the natural ecosystems that are already in place. So yeah.
Yeah, I think there are also quite common challenges for cities globally. And as a architect and an academic who had that global exposure and experience, and before we ask our final question, I'm curious if there's one thing that the rest of the world can learn from Mexico with their ongoing development happening right now and all this excitement, what could that be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think right now Mexico is experiencing great culture of design. There's a lot of, you might say, there's a lot of great designers doing beautiful work that are creating very successful projects, both in terms of private projects for developers or public projects for governments. So I think something that maybe is not the world learning from Mexico, but something that we are learning from the rest of the world is that design matters.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's really important. Design is a tool to create better environments, but also create a sort of identity, to be proud of being a Mexican, not just through heritage, but what you could create currently, understanding that heritage. I think, and it's not generally going to create recreate the past, but understand from the past, which is something that I think you mentioned in the warm up about Barragan. I think it's something Barragan understood quite great. So he merged history with his cultural moment, with the idea of contemporary art at his time, the idea of the steel, the idea how to reinterpret the ideas of Le Corbusier, of the openness, of the fluid space, with the massing of the heritage, that massiveness of traditional Mexican architecture. And the idea of how to use the color for the emotions. So I think we're in a very interesting moment for design, and I think Mexico is reflecting that. I think we're also experiencing a very interesting moment for public space. I think we lost a lot of public space in the past decades, and it was not important for the city. So there's an awareness of public space, and there's a lot of great public space projects happening across Mexico. Yeah, I don't know if that, and I don't know if
That's
the world
great.
is learning from Mexico, but I think we are more like reflecting certain lessons from the world.
Yeah, before we go to the last question, I'm wondering if you can give us your top three architecture firms.
Past or present?
Yes.
Both, yeah. Or top three Mexican architects?
Definitely, you need to talk about Luis Barragan. For me, learning about Luis Barragan and his work, it's a very difficult architect to understand through drawings. It's extremely difficult because their plans are very labyrinthic. They are not as clear as the modernist plans in which you see a clear party. So for me, it was a very revealing experience to visit Luis Barragan projects. And that's when you start to understand that it's not enough to design in plan, section, elevation, and you need to have a certain spatial sensibility. So I think he's a very important architect. Another architect, I don't. She's not an architect. She was more like a designer, but Clara Porcet. She's a very important designer. She was also multidisciplinary, so she worked with objects and with different scales, but also with art. So I think Clara Porcet, her furniture pieces are amazing. She's able to mix contemporary world art views and trends and to lock them down with Mexican materials and sensibilities as well. So I really like her work a
Hmm.
lot. And yeah, there's um, I think something that is really interesting happening currently right now in Mexico is there are a lot of women architecture firms that are really interesting. Tatiana Bilbao, Fernanda Canales, Frida Escobedo, that are changing the design landscape with projects that are amazing, but also very sensible with in terms of materials, the reading of the context, um, etc. Yeah, I will say those, and I think that the greatest modern heroic architect was maybe Mario Pani. And what's interesting about Mario Pani is that he was sort of our Le Corbusier. He sort of took the idea of the international style and the modern movement and translated it into projects that are really interesting. So, for example, if you go to the Miguel Alemán project, which is currently still a housing project, you can see the richness of the public space, and you can see the what it actually means free ground floor plan, that the buildings are floating in pilotis and you have that permeability throughout the ground floor, but also using really simple materials with this very noble idea of the pilotis and the free flowing space, but with local bricks and local concrete, and also embedding in other projects that currently were demolished because of the earthquakes, but embedding and working with local artists and embedding murals into their projects and creating this idea of the total artistic building. It's also interesting. And Mario Pani, I think, created a very strong architecture tradition through UNAM that it's still very present around now. If I will add another one that it was really interesting is Juan O'Gorman, because O'Gorman started in a very utilitarian architecture with this idea of functional architecture, and he created the houses for Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo.
Hmm.
And it's very similar to the awesome fan house of Le Corbusier with the saw roof and everything. But he ended with his own house, which is like a carved volcano house, which is very organic and it's very rooted to the earth. So sort of he had this very interesting process in which he started with a modernist trend and then rooted to the ground to a more hands down organic idea of architecture. So I think he was also very interesting. He was also a painter and a very artistic practitioner. So
Hmm.
yeah,
We call this show Most Podern because we find that we're sort of unclear what era we're living in right now. So the question for you is, and we ask this to all of our guests, in the future, when we look back on the time we're in at the moment, how will we describe this era that we're currently living through?
that's an excellent question. And yeah, we are not even able to name ourselves, right? Name our moment. I think it's an era of rapid changes. So if you ask me that question 20 years ago, it will be different from now. So I think every 10 years, the answer is going to change quite fast. But right now, currently, I think there's a moment of awareness. I think in the past, we were not really aware of what we were doing. And we're just building because we were able to build and because it was possible. But right now, I can see there's awareness of what we are doing, and there's an understanding that everything that we're doing has an impact. So hopefully that will mean something. So, for example, a very dumb example is that everyone is doing their silly images with AI, but there's an awareness that that's having a very important water footprint. So I think that awareness is going to help us to make better decisions. So I think when we see this moment in the future, I think it's going to be the shifting moment, shifting gears in which we understood what we were doing and we start to do things differently, making steps, thinking more about where that step will take us, and not just because we can walk. In the past, we were just doing things because they were possible, and right now we are thinking if that possibility is the right way to go.
No,
I
I
don't know
love
if
that.
it has a name for that.
We'll figure out the name later, but I love the response. I guess it's more moving with more purpose towards a better future. Well, Ruben, thank you so much for joining us. Before we go, you've described all your work. If our listeners want to find out more about you or your work, see images of it, where could they go?
You can go to our website, that is lsscorelab.com, middle score, and that will also, there's a link there to our Instagram page. We're trying to update it as much as possible, but with the pace of work, sometimes it gets a little bit behind. But yeah, you can check it there.
Wonderful. And we'll link to that in the description below. But I just want to thank you, Ruben. You've painted an amazing picture about what development, what urbanism is like in Mexico these days. I'm always fascinated to see all the new images that are coming out of LS Lab. I think it's incredible the amount of work that you put in, both getting it built and constructed, but also the thought that I know goes into it, and being able to sit here and talk to you about that process has been truly wonderful. So for that, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our listeners for listening to Most Podern. As always, like and subscribe, and we'll get back to another episode soon.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite.
Most Podern.
Most Podern.
Most Podern.
Most Podern.
모스트 포던 팟캐스트